Good evening, and welcome to the Thursday evening gala program of the 2006 Montana Festival of the Book. I'm Mark Sherouse, Executive Director of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, which sponsors this event, and through our grants and other programs, many other events like it throughout our state. The Montana Festival of the Book would not be possible without the assistance of numerous individuals and organizations, many of whom are listed in this evening's program. Please take note of them, and especially the local businesses and organizations. For their support, we are most grateful. Butte is a special place in Montana, indeed Western history and culture. Montana would be a different and far less interesting place without the influence that Butte exerted in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 21st century, and particularly in the past year, there's been a great revival of intellectual and literary interest in Butte. And it is our purpose this evening to celebrate and explore Butte through that literature and cultural expression, its place in Montana and Western history, and indeed in the identity of Montana and Montanans. It is my pleasure now to introduce Jim Driscoll, a longtime Butte resident, retired educator, civic leader, columnist for the Montana Standard, and a distinguished former member of the Montana Committee for the Humanities. Jim will preside over the first half of this evening's program. Jim Driscoll.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm happy and flattered to be involved in this evening, which I think is the very first time that this wonderful Montana Festival of the Book has devoted an entire major event to the literature and art of just one Montana city. Of course, if you were going to do it, Butte is the place to do it by, in my unbiased opinion. I've lived all my life in Butte, minus college and my first 8 married years, spent in New York City and around there. We were always completely at home in the city because Butte people have always had an urban view of things. And I love my MCH friend Joan Hoff's story of her father visiting her in New York and saying, "This is the best place you've lived yet, Joan. It's a lot like Butte." So why would we hangers-on in this polluted shadow of former glory have the hubris to say things like that? I hope the artistic voices you'll hear tonight may provide a hint of an answer. Butte was not well portrayed in literature for a long time. There were some absolutely terrible books about Butte, like The War of the Copper Kings, about a step away from a dime novel. There was Red Harvest, but that was seriously noir and minorly Butte, in my opinion. And then Myron Brennig wrote some lovely books in the 30s, such as Wide Open Town, which is in print, and Singerman and the Sisters, which are not in print, but The Sisters was a terrific movie vehicle for Betty Davis and Errol Flynn. We have cherished memories of them riding up a street right by our house with a beautiful central fountain in the middle of the street, which never existed in Butte, of course. And Myron seems to have passed out of most people's thoughts because his style is unfortunately more like Fenimore Cooper than Hemingway. But then in 1971, Richard K. O'Malley, a Butte boy who had risen to run various overseas bureaus for the Associated Press, wrote a memoir called Mile High, Mile Deep, and Butte was in the hands of a real writer. Russell Chatham calls O'Malley's prologue a perfectly crafted prose poem. And like all poetry, it needs to be read aloud, and so it will. And this is it, simply titled Summer. The deer moved shyly along Bell Creek, foraging in the tall grass that moved with the wind. The willows were sweet by the water, and the iris and wild violets brushed the soil with the soft colors of the sky at sunset. The Rockies reared tall, and the hill was pine-studded and fresh in the high mountain air. Bear snuffled along the flanks of the foothills, and at night the soprano song of the coyotes made lonesome music in the darkness. Then the men came, and one of them grubbed into the hill and found copper, Others came and they ripped the guts out of the hill. They pitched gallows frames and they put cages on them and they went deep into the ground for the copper, always for the copper. Irishmen working as far south as Leadville, Colorado heard about the Butte strike, and Finns sweating it out in the Minnesota iron workings heard about it, and the Swedes and the Cornishmen and the Montenegrins and the Italians and the Yugoslavs and the Norwegians heard about it, and the Greeks too, but they thought in terms of restaurants. Working men have to eat, and the gamblers from everywhere. They all came to Butte. They filled its dirt streets with the noise of a dozen tongues, and they filled its tunnels and stopes and manways with themselves. And the sound of buzzies biting into the rock was loud down below. And the smelters went up with their stacks vomiting yellow sulfurish smoke that stung and burned. The smoke rolled out over the prairies and the trees and the grass, thick, sulfurous, suffocating. The grass went first, and then the leafed trees. Only the firs and the pines stayed when they weren't chopped down, dug up, dragged into the deep dark where the men gouged for copper. There were no longer deer along Bell Creek, and the coyotes moved into the foothills. Nobody saw bears anymore, and the iris and violets were long gone. Silver Bow Creek turned reddish brown with the tailings from the mines and the smelters, and at first small silvery fish floated bottom up. Then there were no fish, and Silver Bow turned copper colored, and the water would kill a man if he were fool enough to drink it. The town grew on the side of the hill, perched on its flanks, and the shacks sprouted like weeds around the mines. There were families that followed, and it was Butte, all at once, out of the copper womb. Finntown, Hungry Hill, Dublin Gulch, Stringtown, Butchertown, Dogtown, Centerville, Meaderville, Walkerville, the Flats, the Cabbage Patch. Talk English at school. Talk Czech, Italian, Yugoslav, Serb, Finn, Swede, Norwegian at home. The old folks don't talk English so good. Grandma don't know a word. Isn't it funny? I wish Grandpa talked something besides Gaelic. He's been here 5 years now. I'll let them alone. They're old. They're set in their ways. And what's wrong with Gaelic? Finn, Yugoslav, any of them. And the whores came. Mercury Street, Galena Street, the Black Cat, the cribs along the street, and the girls tapping with their knitting needles to get your eye. $2, Jack. Come on in. Show you a good time. Butte, man, she's wide open. You want to gamble? Step up to the faro table. A crap shooter, roll 'em out. Poker, any way you want it. And the Chinese came. The drifters and stay-ons from the old railroad days. Washy shirty, like a noodles, fantan. Chinatown grew in its twisty-turny way off South Main Street. The gallows frames girded the hill, then took it wholly. The mountain con, the Stewart, the bell, the diamond, the orphan girl, the Ophir, the granite mountain. The tramway that never sweat, the moonlight, the Leonard, the black rock, they turned out the rock. 25 miles away, the biggest stack in the world went up at Anaconda and the ore trains rumbled day and night. Get the rock in the box. What the hell is that nipper? I need some tools. You can never find a nipper when you want him. And the nipper who handed out the tools kept caches in the mines. If he liked you, you got good tools. If he didn't, that's tough, Jack. That's all I got right now. The powder monkeys. Now, they're all nuts anyway and get blown up sooner or later. They swarmed down and the dynamite went into the drill holes. Count the holes, lad. Always remember, when she blows, count the holes. You'll put a pick in one that didn't go off and your old lady won't recognize you. Get the rock in the box. Bend your back. The car only holds a ton. All right, take 5. We got enough done for a while. Give me a smoke, lad. Muck the rock into the car and away to the station. The chippy takes it up. Now, if you ever ride in a chippy, lad, lay down. The way they hoist them up, you get your brains knocked out standing up. And the town grew. She brawled and fought and laughed and tunneled and blasted and dug and shoveled. Butte, a mile high and a mile deep. Get the rock in the box. No wonder Russell Chatham says that stunned me like an unanticipated slap. And it led him to publish a beautiful new edition of the book from his Clark City Press. It had been out of print before, with historic photos from Ellen Crain's Butte archives. And that was followed by Ellen Crain and Janet Finn's Motherlode, and a beautiful new edition of Ed Leahy's poems, all parts of tonight's program. If there is indeed a Butte Mafia, it looks like that outsider Russell has been brought into it. And he's hard at work serving the family business. And now a few more tempting literary tidbits. I had the sex shakes so bad I'd get dizzy. Missoula was a provincial little valley town that depended primarily on reducing prehistoric trees to narrow boards. After grandfather died, I was presented with his cape and a secret Masonic book on how to rule the world. These are all from Swain Wolfe's notebook, The Boy Who Invented Skiing. He's also written the novels The Woman Who Lives in the Earth, The Parrot Trainer, which won 2 Southwest Book of the Year awards. Many of you probably know he's a Missoula guy, and Missoula is prominent in The Boy Who Invented Skiing. Only the last sixth or so is about his life in the Butte mines as they neared permanent shutdown. And I avoided quoting from there so you could hear it from the mouth of the creator. I'm sure he won't read his entire Butte section, but I for one wouldn't mind if he did. As Tracy said of Hepburn, there ain't much meat on her, but what there is churse. Well, the Butte in Swain's book is church too, but so is the rest of the book. Please welcome Swain Wolfe.
Well, I think I got the pages all mixed up, so you just have to bear with this. The mine that I worked in that I referred to in this piece was the Badger State Mine, which was up behind Walkerville and somewhat to the east. And these are some pieces from there. Underground, you went through an inadvertent selection process that allowed you to find your place, which is to say, to discover who you were in that curious world. It might not apply anywhere else, but it let you and the others know what to expect underground. At first, being green and relatively expendable, I got one lousy job after another and wasn't told how to do them. Maybe the miners were waiting for me to ask. Except for that first night, I don't remember asking anyone anything. Why, I don't know, but I watched and listened. Being scared can make you an ardent observer. I think I was 23 when I was there. Beside being better storytellers, the miners were generally smarter than men in most other professions. Working underground had its selective aspects. The slow of mind and the unlucky were maimed or killed sooner than later. Fortunately, I worked there for such a short time, the hand of nature never had a chance to pluck me out. On the surface, men tended to talk and walk and behave differently than they did underground. Some preferred the mines to life on top. Being 1,000 feet down changed the way they treated one another. There was a kind of emotional compression, as though the weight of the earth and the air held them in check. Arguments never turned ballistic. The only fights I witnessed were in Spilling's bar. Underground, the potential for a major reorganization of your body parts was a constant presence. You didn't need to add to real risk by throwing punches. We survived in the underworld, held together by some fragile element that evaded definition, even detection. Like dark matter in the universe, you know it's there, but the universe couldn't exist without it. We had parolees, guys on the run, check forgers, armed robbers, and murderers. Underground, you never know, and it didn't seem to matter. The mines let you escape the viciousness, uncertainties, and anxieties on the surface. We were protected from angry wives, bill collectors, mortgages, cops, the INS, and the FBI. In that respect, the mines were like the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. Once I got used to the underground, I never felt anxious until the shift ended, and I had to face the Wookiees lurking above in the real world. The Wookiees were a real thing. The FBI cars were notable for not having hubcaps. Either the government wouldn't buy them or the kids stole them, I don't know which. But I had a nose for the cars without hubcaps, which became known as the Wooks or the Wookiees. And the reason for that I'll let go for now, but the enforcers never went into the mines. They waited until you came up and grabbed you half naked in the dries or at home in front of your children. Unlike the Church of the Middle Ages, the sanctuary of the mines lasted a shift at a time. Some men spent their hours on the surface waiting for the safety of the next shift. We worked at the company's whim, lived on skill and luck, and were paid enough to survive. Mankey, a Czech who had studied to be a Catholic priest, was arrested by the communists and put in a slave labor mine in northeastern Czechoslovakia. 4 years later, he helped kill the guards and escaped to Austria. He got to come to the US because he was Catholic, but he hated the American church, so he worked as a miner, first in Arizona and then Butte. He told me slaves were considered property. The communists took care of their property. They fed it, they clothed it, kept it healthy, put a roof over its head. Mankey was hard and bitter. The only funny thing I ever heard him say was, "Under communism, I had property rights." The town came to see the company as a force of nature. The company was not that much different from the fires that smoldered at 3,000 feet beneath the surface, sucking oxygen from granite, waiting for an unsuspecting crew from a distant mine to blast through, relinquishing a long-anticipated gush of fresh air and human flesh. The Junior League, the Wives of Wealthy Men Club, were educated women married to Anaconda Copper Mining Company and Montana power executives, and the town's wealthier physicians, bankers, and lawyers. They thought it was necessary and proper to bring culture to the Butte underclass. Apparently, our own culture was wanting. To this end, they established a foreign film festival. Foreign films meant anything by Fellini, Antoni, and Brunel. There were forgotten others. Not every miner went to these movies, but those who did dressed for the occasion. The rich husbands never came. Miners, who I never guessed owned a tie, showed up in suits and hats. The women wore their best dresses and high heels that made them look taller and perked up their butts. Culture was becoming another form of church. We'd come to be empowered to ride the arc of new culture. This was, 63? We took our wives and girlfriends, or more likely, they took us. We arrived on time, stood on one side of the lobby, and tried not to stare at the wives of wealthy men clustered on the other side discussing Cahiers du Cinéma, about a young French director who never put his camera on a tripod and invented cinéma verité, the reality film. Little did we know what would become of that simple experiment. We didn't like Antonioni. Fellini, at least, could tell a story. We didn't need to read subtitles, and many of us couldn't anyway. We liked Federico because he had appetites. He stuffed us speechless and robbed us senseless. For me, it was a time of stories. Mines, films, bars, books, all were telling stories. Being fatalists, the miners told stories about fate, and Fellini told stories about love. It wasn't long before the movie stopped, not because there wasn't an audience, but because it was wrong. The junior league ladies had good intentions. They'd been educated in Eastern schools and caught the intellectual disease at the time. They wanted to share, but discovered it was impossible to share with people whose feeble lives were controlled by their husbands' heavy hands. When workers pretend they're not workers and masters pretend they're not masters, it makes everyone uneasy. In the end, the powerful and the powerless could not share cultures, much less the same space. This piece is called Blown to Bits, and is also titled TOE, or TOE, for the theory of everything. About 4 or 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning, Margaret and I were jolted out of our sleep by an enormous blast. We lay in the dark and speculated on what had happened. When it was light, we got dressed and drove across town to see for ourselves. We were not alone in our curiosity. A good part of the town had gravitated to the slag heaps down on the flats. The heaps had been made 50 years or more before, when hot slag from the smelters was dumped into huge forms 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 20 to 30 feet high. They were laid out on the flats like dominoes, with spaces between them large enough to drive a large truck. I'd forgotten it was Sunday, so I was surprised to see almost everyone there dressed for church. They were scattered all over the slag heap, on top and in the roadways, in groups of 2, 3, or 4, mothers, fathers, and children, taking a step at a time in a kind of forced slow motion. No one said a word. They just stared at the ground, searching for something. It was a Fellini movie without sound. That morning, some men were transferring a truckload of dynamite that they'd stolen from an ACM powder magazine to a second truck. It was later reported that the stolen dynamite was destined for the Irish Republican Army. I doubt anyone ever knew the entire story. The truth of the matter is, I've heard several versions of this. But the police heard enough that they had the transfer staked out. A cop fired a shot into the powder. And I understand it couldn't have been the powder, it had been a box of caps. The police claimed it was an accident. Nobody but the man who fired the shot knew for sure, and nobody was sure who fired the shot. The explosion knocked out windows in houses half a mile away, and there was nothing of consequences left of the thieves or the trucks. The Junior League had prepared me for the absurd. The people of the town had outfitted themselves for their weekly meeting with God. But along the way, they looked down instead of up and got distracted by body parts. Some days you go out looking for the theory of everything, and all you find is a toe. I call this dimension. A three-dimensional image of the underground began to take shape in my mind after working various levels and sections of the Badger, moving through drifts that intersected with drifts to other mines, blurring any sense of where one mine ended and another began. That lattice work of tunnels revealed ore-rich areas where molten copper once flowed through liquid granite, churning, twisting, and folding, then cooling to solid rock. In places, pockets of punky granite needed careful attention and endless shoring, or they would give way and the drift would collapse without warning. Surely the maze that grew in my mind was both misshapen and limited. I was never deeper than 3,200 feet, and I doubt I traveled more than a mile in any direction through the jogs and turns that Irishmen, Finns, Norwegians, Swedes, and men of a dozen nationalities had lasted in dogged pursuit of copper, zinc, and gold at the cost of countless limbs and lives. However distorted, I had a distinct vision of an underground defined by burrows made from desperate need and uncommon greed. Stories and fantasies told by miners extended my tangled knowledge into the unexplored regions. Caverns 1,000 feet high, a mile down, a geode found in the Stewart as large as a miner's shack, 4-foot seams of solid copper, lunch buckets full of silver, gold nuggets the size of apples. There were miners who swore of miracles, the Son of God floating through the main drift on the 1300 asking for a drink. Another saw a man fall down a shaft, splattering against the sides until he turned to rain. The Virgin Mother, arms outstretched, rose up through the rain of the falling man. Life underground was a fantasy lived by blind men feeling their way through the intestines of a monster earth, dedicated to carving her a cavernous belly, stealing her copper gold bile, and escaping alive. Working in the mines changed the surface of the land for me. After several weeks underground, I could not look at the surface without wondering what was underneath. The lattice work of the underground found a conscious expansion in the minds of lifelong miners. I've lost my place, obviously. In the minds of lifelong miners, extending itself up to the surface is a way of thinking. Miners were the archaeologists of human behavior. The miners saw a deeply dimensional world. I suspect the ancient exploration of caves, finding our way into the minds of the earth, affected human thought, made us aware that something was hidden beneath the surface. Perhaps we talked to the earth by painting our stories on the walls of her caves. No doubt we prayed for her to make us powerful so one day we could escape her complexity, depth, and grasp. One night at the end of a shift, I set off a charge in the Grizzlies on a 1300. The wires touched. I felt my body shake from the force of the blast, but there was no sound. Images from my entire life were rushing through my mind. Images of childhood, mountains, towns, cities, jobs, people, scenes from Fellini, Bernal, and Antonioni, all coalesced into a thought. I would tell stories. I would make films. When we're young, we can imagine anything at all without consequences. In the station, waiting for the cage, I started explaining my plans to Delph, a short, earthy man and his tall partner, Enoch, whose big teeth magnified a memorable grin. We turned our lamps off, packed into the cage, and rode up in the dark. There were 9 of us, pressed so tight we were warm on 3 sides. As the cage rattled and slammed toward the surface, they listened to me chatter on about making films. I didn't shut up until we reached the top. The tender threw the bar back, swung the door open, and released the pressure of bodies. The moment we hit daylight and 20 below, Delph turned to Enoch and said, "I ain't made plans in 30 years." I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest. I was ashamed for humiliating Delph. At the same time, I was stunned by the notion of never making plans. It seemed like a terrible sentence. But I looked at Delph and saw a man without bitterness or irony. He was simply making an observation. Longtime miners usually achieve a kind of working man's grace. They had expectations, a sense of what they should do and how to behave, what was expected of them, and what was expected had been shaped by several generations of miners before them in a world perfected over time. Those who were graceful and accepting seemed like the masters of the art of living. For generations, miners have searched for that place where they could give themselves to the inevitable, like a gathering of Buddhist monks with headlamps. Working in the mills, the woods, and the mines allowed me to gain back a small piece of what I'd lost when I left the real world of mountains and rivers and animals and moved to the man-made realities of town. I would never achieve the quality of grace and acceptance I found in the miners, but they and the work itself had given me a richer life and new ways of seeing. There is a thing that happens underground that can happen nowhere else. An arrangement of motion, light, and the passage of your mind and body through the earth. If you stand looking forward on the back of the last car in a long train whose motor car is around the bend, you will be moving through a tunnel supported by stole timbers, illuminated only by the lamp on your hard hat. It feels as though reality is being projected from the middle of your head, and you are always moving into a world you can never quite enter because you are always in the dark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Swain. There may be a Butte resident or two who will require further explanation of your phrase, the roaring human catastrophe known as Butte. But the alley behind the M&M bar often hosts philosophical discussions of that sort. I understand that Ed Leahy has a novel, A Thin Air Gang, forthcoming. But here's some anonymous words from the back jacket notes for his collected poems, Birds of a Feather, published last year by, of course, Clark City Press. If ever there could be said to be a wholehearted consensus among the literati of Montana, who otherwise have sometimes been known to be territorial, adversarial, and contentious, it is that Ed Leahy is the state's finest living poet. Ed is also a frequent presence here and a loyal supporter of this festival, and he never fails to impress. Ed happens to be from the same Butte High class as my wife is from Butte Central, and he read at their combined 50th reunion last year. You could tell that a lot of ex-classmates were proud to be associated with Ed and the work he continues to produce. They know he came from where they came from, whatever different paths were taken since. But a small pod of half-century ago cheerleaders and party girls over on the side briefly giggled, rolled their eyes, and generally wondered in fluent body language what in the hell this man was going on about. I figured that was probably one of the most gratifying reviews that Ed received all year. Because Ed's poetry, like Sandberg's, is often rough and unpretty, and his real toads inhabit imaginary mine shafts or other hellholes, never gardens. It's tough on party girls, but it's a rich vein for those with a good eye and a good ear. Here's Ed Leahy.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. I see why Swain was bothered by looking out. It's a lot nicer to be able to see people. Well, if you don't mind, I'll remove my dentures. They're new, and I feel like a shoe in my mouth. A letter to the editor. Instead of "I like it," someone said the Chamber of Commerce slogan should have read, "Butte is my town, let's face it," which I couldn't. Surface wit will not dampen a ghostly rattle. The cough of miner's con is heard hacking silicotic glitter. How could I, whose grandfather kissed with flaky lips, evidence of ruined lungs, live with all that wit? Should I ignore the brittle whore whose rotten flower thighs smothered old Sean while flat-hat congressmen chat about litter bugs? Filth in the street, debris, garbage cans, volunteers, the paper said. I remember Sean sat out of a wrestling card, drunk and puking sharp death. They're all skimers, Ed, every mother one, and they hung Mucky Malone to the Rocker Bridge. Papers came out as usual. Father Fitz said the last rites, and I bled salty love from the corner of wake eyes down generous legs of Sean's little girl. So suck up your own litter, file it in your copper shaft, blow it down the Kelly, belch in a Mexican miner's face before he tastes your brand of chili. I was living down here working as a graduate assistant at the University of Montana. I had loyally subscribed to the Montana Standard, and it was in the Standard that I saw the article asking for volunteers to clean up the streets of Butte. So I was prompted to write that poem, and I sent it to the editor. You laugh, but to give him credit, he published it in the newspaper. The poem I'm best known for, and the poem that I've made the most money from, those things don't necessarily go together, is a poem I've called The Blind Horses. I publish this poem every Christmas. I keep the copyright and I send it out to little journals and magazines and places that I think might be interested in the poem. And it usually makes me $25 or $50. In one way, I think I've made more money with this one poem than I've made in my book. Although the book is catching up fast. The Blind Horses. The old man in the hospital bed with his horny yellow foot stuck through the stainless rails claimed that July night, the one he picked to die on, he smelled sulfur on his gown. When he was my age, he worked the lower levels of the Lex in a great underground corral, yoked iron tongues to wagons filled with ruby silver and peacock copper rock, flaked sweet hay to horses, shot the worn out. Dozens of tramway horses hauled hard against whipple trees, rubbed the timbered tunnels clean, pulling down the cribbed up drifts, brass lanterns swinging, work bits in their teeth, slick with mine damp and cold to the touch. Dry stalls in the crosscut cave of that stone corral caught fire in '98. The horses, tunnel blind from lack of light, burned up in the green flame that licked the lagging black in the Lexington mine. I met his eyes cracked white like a drunk's who hasn't had a drink in months. He said he could hear hoofbeats ring and click against the granite footwalls. He complained of being cold. His nostrils flared. I hear them breathing, Ed. I used to read out of pages that I would just come with a handful of pages that had my poems on them, and so I'm not used to having a book where I have a nice menu in the front. I want to read the only poem I've ever written that is an Ars Poetica poem. I don't ordinarily go in for writing poems about how to write poems or poems about poems. And I didn't exactly do that in this poem either, although I think in a way it contains advice to the poet. It's also a portrait poem. It's a poem about a welder, a Butte welder. I've dedicated it to my father. Give O'Leary's Ironworks for Big Ed. You hear a lot of lies about O'Leary, but he could seal a crack in steel no matter what the size. His arc welder would strike white fire and a bead of blue-black rod would slide along between cherry streaks and acrid smoke would curl away to leave clean married steel, not too frail or buttered up, but straight and strong, hard as mill-forged rail. Of course, you might say, don't use that example as a metaphor for poetry. Welding is a matter of utility, and you'd be right. Still, I remember the look on his face when he'd lift his great helmet and sneak up on the finished job with his unprotected eyes. It was always between him and the piece of steel, a struggle of molecules and will. Often others would say to him, "Damn good job," or some such thing. If it was, he'd grin and look again, as if he thought the natural light would show a flaw, or a bridge that didn't fuse. Convinced, I guess, that in his struggle with the steel, he could seldom really win. He knew perfection could conceal the wound beneath the arc of his art. I liked him for that. Well, one more poem. This poem is called The Ballad of the Board of Trade Bar. Coal Oil Belle was a red lamp legend in a brown town. She worked her trade behind a smelter stack in the echo of the night shift whistle. Her polished symbol, the hurricane lamp, red as a black widow's belly, swung in bronze relief, an evening star above the dark oak door of the Board of Trade Bar. Belle's fame is now renowned. In a town of misery, one needs sentimental history. I've never heard it said that anyone thinks it's strange. They often neglect to tell of the madam's final bed, a $2,000 engraved coffin, lined with silver beneath a smoking torch, 10 pounds of bone. Her house is in the ground. Some men know when the whistles blow, her earless sockets listen as her hip bones move to the pocket sound of a lover's jingle. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ed. I really wanted to say a few words about some people on the second half of tonight's program, but I didn't want to steal Pat Williams' thunder. And then I realized that was sort of like the impossible oxymoron or something. Pat's a Butte boy, and he has worked in the real mean streets of D.C., and he's a natural wordsmith, and I don't think anybody steals Pat Williams' thunder, so I think I'm safe in saying there are two places that everyone should visit in order to understand Butte. One is the Butte Archives, and the other is the Granite Mountain Memorial. And Michael Punke spoke at the 10th anniversary of the memorial, and later at more length in the archives the same day, this past spring. And it's clear that Michael's just about become an adopted son of the hill. His understanding and feeling for the place are abundantly clear, and his fine book about this greatest disaster in hard rock mining history is a real classic. Besides visiting those places, the best understanding you can have of Butte will come from an article in Harper's Magazine of October 1996, and it explains in depth the blasted moonscape you see from the memorial overlook. It's written by Edwin Daub, that we all call Ed. And Ed was in the first composition class I taught at Butte High when I returned from New York, and then 25 years later, when he had totally disappeared from me, he came back to Butte. And he told me he hit the rails east the day after graduation, determined to be a writer, and he did. And how? Both the title and the subtitle of this article should arouse envy in any writer, and they are Pennies from Hell. In Montana, the bill for America's copper comes due. It also contains the best description of Butte I've ever read. In a region dominated by haystacks and cow towns, Butte soon became a boisterous island of urban depravity and unbridled industrial capitalism. October 96, Harper's, look it up. This is where tonight's movie by Pam Roberts, written by Ed, all began, and it's a great and essential read. You notice how much about Butte seems to be hard and rough and gritty, and they say that that's what creates character. Well, I know that it has certainly created some characters. And one that stays with me is old Doc Hall, my dentist in my preteen years. I swear that Tim Conway was treated by Doc Hall sometime back in those days. But Tim's little Norski businessman shuffle was exactly how flat-footed Doc Hall walked. And like all dentists, Doc could stuff your mouth full of sharp-edged objects. But then instead of asking you to discourse on the meaning of life, he'd sit back and tell jokes. And then he'd watch and just see how you managed to squeeze a little laugh past your metal mouthful. At the time, as a 10-year-old altar boy, I considered this one shockingly racy. But I never forgot it, at least until now. So Saturday confessions were going on ground at St. Patrick's Church, and the priest was feeling very proud of himself for shuffling them out right quick, and all of a sudden he hears this obviously aged and female voice saying, "Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been an entire week since my last confession. I committed the sin of adultery once. For these and all my sins, I'm heartily sorry." You committed the sin of adultery once. Yes, Father, it's a terrible thing and I regret it. Could you go into a little more detail about how this happened? She says, well, I knew that it was a sin, but his eyes were so deep and dark, and I could feel his breath upon my neck, and soon I could not say nay to his impulsive manliness. Priest says to himself, by God, I think this is Miss O'Leary. Miss O'Leary. And she's 80 if she's a day. He says, is that Miss O'Leary? So, yes, Father, it isn't very contrite too. He says, Miss O'Leary, are you trying to tell me that this terrible sin of adultery happened in just the last week since your last confession? She says, oh no, Father, no, it happened 63 years ago, but I just like to talk about it. And now there's a phrase that defines Butte. Boy, we just like to talk about it. Ask a Butte person a question, and as in New York City, you get a dissertation, a history. And that's at the heart of our next book, Motherlode. Ellen Crain is a storyteller from a family of storytellers. Her father, Kevin Shannon, is Butte's reigning Shenandoah, and she continues the family gift. She and/or Kevin have been commentators in several documentaries, including the History Channel's War of the Copper Kings and PBS's The Irish in America, Long Journey Home. She's built the Butte Archives into a place with an international reputation for excellence. Irish President Mary McAleese recently donated her speaking fee from Notre Dame to the Butte Archives in tribute to its accessible treasure trove of Irish American history. And for a fine yarn, after this thing is over here, ask Ellen about her doomed attempt to convince the makers of the movie Chaplin that Butte was actually like Chicago, not like Virginia City in Charlie's time. Ellen's college pal was Janet Finn, now a respected professor of social work at UM. They remained friends, and together they conceived a book filled with talking about it. Janet's academic expertise and Ellen's nose for a great tale combined to tell the untold stories of strong women behind the strong men of a mining town. They collected the stories. Russell Chatham, in between his career as an artist with over 300 one-man shows, offered to publish, and the idea has now become a big, generous book filled with generous and inspiring stories, many of them written by non-writers, at least until now, because they caught the bug. One of the contributors is Carol Williams, a Butte native, former teacher, former state representative, and recent Missoula County state senator. And here to talk about Motherlode are Ellen Crain, Janet Finn, Carol Williams, Russell Chatham.
Well, this Butte thing, as it concerns Clark City Press, is completely serendipitous and was unforeseen. And Jim, thank you for that reading of Dick O'Malley's introductory prose poem was really brilliant. Clark City Press, which was begun about 18, in fact, exactly 18 years ago, has published by now nearly 40 books. Took a little break for a few years between about 1994 and maybe 2002 or 3, selling only its backlist. But as I say, this Butte thing was completely serendipitous. I stumbled on, completely by accident, O'Malley's Mile High, Mile Deep. Started reading it and realized that what I was seeing, what I was reading, was a remarkable piece of work. And I've shown the book to novelists all over the country and even from other countries, and they have universally commented that it was one of the most beautifully crafted books that they'd ever seen. By the same token, I stumbled upon Ed Leahy's poetry, and the same thing happened. I started reading it and I thought, this is absolutely unbelievable. And so I made it my business to find Ed and to talk to him and to get his book in print. And I certainly hope that he's found his teeth too by now. And also, we also have in production a novel by Ed called The Thin Air Gang, which in our plan at the moment is to have that come out this spring. And on top of that, I was approached by Janet and Ellen, who wanted to explain an idea that they had for a book that would be a women's history of Butte. And I don't imagine that they got 10 minutes into that explanation. I thought, good Lord, there's another book that has to be done. And I have to say that they did a brilliant job. And I'm very, very pleased and honored to have been able to make it a reality, because they applied some beautiful, intense scholarship to it. Now, what are we going to do, you guys, by the way? Are you guys going to talk about the book? So I think what I'm going to do then is, and just quickly before I bring them up here so that they can talk to you about the book, there is, believe it or not, aside from Ed's novel, there is even another Butte book that I'm doing, which is also a complete accident. It's called The Berkeley Pit. It's a novel by a woman named Dorothy Bryant, who lives in Berkeley, California, and it's beautiful. She's a brilliant writer. I think a complete national treasure. We're bringing out that out this spring too. So here are Ellen and Janet.
Thanks for being here this evening, and we'd like to say a special thanks to the Montana Committee for the Humanities, to the Red Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, and to Russell Chatham and Clark City Press for making this book possible. You may have noticed that the story of Butte tends to be a masculine story. The story of Butte has been told many ways and many times, and there's many chapters to that story, but rarely are women's voices heard in that story of Butte. And we saw Motherlode as an opportunity to really explore that richly textured, untold stories of women's lives, to get beyond the cameo role of the Madam of Bordello, and look at the women who inspired us, who shaped a community, and who have sustained a community over time.
As Janet said, and as I'm sure you've heard this evening, Butte really is a man's town, and they really defined how the city's culture would be lived out. But how could it be lived out without women? Those men did need to be fed and housed and cared for. And knowing that myself, as a Butte woman, I know the role of women in our city. And it really struck me as the archivist how important some of these stories were to be told. And having worked with Janet on a book that she did prior to Motherlode about women in Butte, I realized that the story is really an important story. And so we thought we would delve into the wellspring of archival holdings and reach out to people who were out there doing work on women and bring them together.
And this project is really, it's sort of a celebration of friendship, of feminism, of dialogue and conversation among women. Ellen and I went to Butte Central High School together and had the opportunity to rekindle a friendship through this project. And it's wonderful to have a friendship that comes out of a project like this stronger. And that's really a gift to me, as are these stories that have been gifts to us. It was wonderful both to kind of get into these dusty boxes and find the vitality inside, as well as to sit at kitchen tables and listen to women's stories that generally began with, "I really don't have much to tell you, my story's not very important." And 2 to 3 hours later, and a lot of coffee, there'd be such a beautiful story. One more thread into this rich texture of Butte that had gone relatively unspoken and unknown.
And as we looked through the papers, they brought to mind images, and we went into archival holdings and pulled together photographs and reached out and started to collect great images that would portray the lives of women. And when you start looking for women, at first it's difficult because you start dealing with mining and it's very hard to find a woman's touch there. And we started to gather together some beautiful images. And as we pulled them together, they became hundreds. And we pulled the best out and had the gift of going to Clark City Press saying, we have all of these images, we're sure you would like to cut some. And at the end of the story, he said, we have to use all of them. Thank you.
As we talked to women and tapped into storytellers and stories, we started seeing some pretty powerful themes emerging. Themes about women's paid and unpaid labor, themes about women's caregiving, the power of women's organizing, whether through formal clubs or informal neighborhood networks, the women that got this community through tough times. The powerful combination of commitments to love of family and community and neighborhood and commitments to justice, to making Butte and the world a better place. And the powerful inspiration passed down intergenerationally among women. And we'll spend the next few minutes sharing a few more of those stories.
I'm going to speak from the chapter that's written by two women who I admire, and I will tell you a story about why this particular chapter is important to me. When I was 17 years old, I went to work in the racetrack bar as a waitress, and Jack Core was the owner there. There were 6 young girls, so we all went to work there. It was a great fun place. And his first thing he said to us was, you get your, up to that union home. You pay your dues. You pay your dues every month, and don't you ever, ever have Val Webster coming in here after me about your union dues. And it was the scariest moments of my life. I climbed 5 flights of stairs, paid my dues. She leaned over the counter and told me what to do and how to do it. And I never missed a union paying event. So, while mining defined Butte as a man's town, the day-to-day operations of the city were heavily dependent upon the labors of women. Thousands of men who descended beneath Butte's surface around the clock had to live and eat somewhere. In these spaces where the comforts of home merged with the need for a service industry to support the mines and miners, women were in charge. Women also earned wages in other service industry fronts in Butte. They worked as waitresses, hotel maids, nursemaids, mangle girls. Mangle girls fed sheets through a massive flat work irons in commercial laundries, and the bucket girls. Bucket girls prepared thousands of lunch buckets every day for underground miners. It was a job that was well paid if you liked the miner and the miner was generous. Like their sisters across the country, Butte's working women faced restricted opportunities, meager salaries, given the diminished social value of women's work. At the same time, Butte's working women were both witnesses to and participants in the struggle for workers' rights, fair wages, and safe working environments. As they engaged with the growing miners' labor movement, their own consciousness as a collective labor force took shape. On June 6th of 1890, a group of 33 working women came together to form the Butte Women's Protective Union. The union was open to all working women and focused its organizing efforts not on a particular trade or craft, but on working women as a class of people whose rights need protection and promotion. In order to gain membership in the union, you simply had to be a woman and work outside of the home. The union quickly translated its commitments into action. In 1903, Butte women led the campaign for a 10-hour workday. Thank God. And in 1904, it waged a victorious campaign against non-union hiring halls in Butte. The Women's Protective Union remained affiliated with the American labor movement until 1905, when it moved even further from craft unionism toward class-based organizing by joining the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. The Women's Protective Union was the largest contention that went to the organizing rally in Chicago. In retrospect, it is very easy to see why the IWW's vision of one great union that embraced all workers was appealing to women. By 1945, the membership had approached 1,000, and women worked 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with the right to overtime pay, sick leave, paid vacations, benefits unheard of for service workers in most part of the country. The union built its power base, forged broad alliances with other labor organizations, and let it be known that it would fight for the rights of its members. For 83 years, the Women's Protective Union was a woman-only organization, until 1973, when it was forced to merge with the cooks and waiters to form the Culinary and Miscellaneous Workers Union 457. That tradition ended. However, when Val Webster published her bylaw book, she did say, and she will also mean he. The Women's Protective Union passed into history, but its legacy lives on in the collective strength and pride of Butte's organized working women. It's an inspiration to working women everywhere.
I'm proud to say that I was a mangle girl in my earlier career. I'm going to try to pretend I can actually see people out here, even though I can't, and I'm going to talk about a woman that really inspired me, Alma Higgins. Alma was a tireless advocate for civic improvement and conservation. She was part of the early conservation movement of the early part of the 20th century, which was so connected to a women's movement. She had this capacity to blend political will and media savvy and aesthetic vision that I really found quite stunning. As I opened those boxes and spent the hours in the archives in 2004, for about 6 months, I felt like I was becoming Alma Higgins as I read her letters and her clippings and went through her journals and diaries. Now, I'm someone who can barely keep a jade plant alive, so for me to be inspired by this sort of consummate gardener was a stretch, but she got inside my head and inside my heart, and I really found her to be such an inspirational woman. Alma was born in Deer Lodge in 1874. She was quite well educated. She married in 1899. In her first winter as a married woman, she and her husband got snowed in, and they couldn't get out to cut a Christmas tree. And so she decorated a small living tree on the porch of her home. And that sparked for her an idea that trees didn't need to be cut to be part of Christmas. And that launched for her what became a lifelong campaign to promote living Christmas trees, which for a number of presidencies, the White House adopted as well. As a young woman, she became very active in women's clubs. She organized the Civic Improvement League of Deer Lodge in 1902, and she soon became a very active member of the Montana Federation of Women's Clubs. And that sort of brought together her interest in conservation with her growing capacity as an organizer. She was really inspired by the work of Gifford Pinchot, the progressive era conservationist who went on to form the first school of forestry at Yale University. And based on his work and what she was learning of him and her growing interest in this conservation movement, she proposed that the Federation of Women's Clubs in Montana also have a forestry committee. And that was the initial step for her then organizing campaign and letter writing campaign to promote forest conservation in the state of Montana. She organized a letter writing campaign to then Senator Joe Dixon to ask for founding of a forestry program and a school of forestry in Montana. In a 1948 radio interview, she sort of shies away from taking full credit, but she talks about the campaign and how within 2 years we had a school of forestry in Missoula. It's interesting that the name of Alma Higgins goes virtually unknown. Alma was a consummate letter writer. She engaged women's clubs across the state to promote conservation and city beautification. She spearheaded an effort to start Arbor Day, working with the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and was instrumental in having us have a state tree selected by school children of the state. And in 1920, Alma Higgins found herself living in Butte. Now, Butte might have been bleak, but Alma was a dreamer, and she resisted this belief that nothing could grow in Butte. In fact, she was incensed by a 1926 article in Liberty magazine where a contributor won $5 for posing the question, in what American city is there no living green things and why, with the answer being Butte, Montana, because of the sulfur dioxide fumes from the smelters. Well, Alma was going to have none of that, and she wanted to look beyond this grit and grime of Butte and just see what was possible there. And she sought out then to explore and look for the gardens that were tucked away in urban spaces, to experiment with high alpine plants and what could thrive in this very brief window that Butte called a growing season. She took a real systematic approach to this. She decided she was going to document these gardens that she could find. She taught herself photography, and then she went out and took photos of any garden that she could find in Butte. And then she did photo displays and worked with local store owners to put these displays up in store windows. She developed a lantern slideshow, sort of the PowerPoint of her day, and traveled from theater to theater around the state, talking about urban gardens and showing the potential of what could grow. If it could grow in Butte, it could grow anywhere. Now, either she's the ultimate optimist or the epitome of foolhardiness, but Alma Higgins founded National Garden Week in Butte in April. It's the third week of April. So it's really pretty remarkable of her vision. She dedicated herself from the 1920s on to beautifying Butte. She took a correspondence course in horticulture from Cornell University and basically made herself sort of the self-appointed landscape architect for the School of Mines. So next time you drive by Montana Tech, take a look at the landscape around it. That was Alma's doing. But she never believed in doing things on her own. She always marshaled others around her to create these conservation efforts and beautification efforts as efforts for community building as well. She organized men's clubs and women's clubs and Boys and Girl Scouts and school children to be part of the teams of workers needed to create this landscaping project. She was a force behind the founding of the Rocky Mountain Garden Club in Butte, and she sort of utilized her role as the vice president of the National Rose Society to start a rose growing campaign. And between 1927 and 1928, Butte school children planted 4,000 rose bushes in Butte. She took to the radio waves. 1929, she got her own show on KGIR radio, a seasonal show about gardening and conservation. She was also a woman of very careful and thoughtful reflection. She pulled back into the solace of gardening and the landscape of Montana as a place really to nurture this powerful aesthetic sense that she then combined with her political will. She sought to capture and create beauty in unexpected places and promoted urban gardens, children's vegetable gardens. She would go off to a mountain cabin up Bear Gulch, which is outside of Twin Bridges, near where her husband had his mine and mill. And she kept daily diaries, not so much of her own personal reflections as of the landscape and the beauty, the temperature, the frost, the plants, all that was surrounding her. Alma was widowed in 1935, and she continued to spend several months a year at her cabin. Here's a writing from her journal in October of 1936. While clouds are swiftly rolling from west to east, part of the time the moon is covered with a thin cloud, and there's a large rosy ring around it. When the clouds disperse, the moon shines forth in all its glory from a sky of deep midnight blue. Being alone does not bother me, but tonight I thought of the danger of walking up and down the icy steps and over the slippery rocks to the spring. When I looked toward the old boarding houses, I thought of the days when my dear old sweetheart and I lived up here, when in 1916 he employed 70 men in the mine and mill. The old mill is demolished, and a new one is over a half-mile down the hill. The watchman for the property lives near the new mill. I sometimes wonder if I'm just a little queer to live up here all alone. I believe I'd feel sorry for any woman who would do the same. From this place of solitude and reflection, Alma renewed her passions and commitments. She went on to spearhead statewide roadside beautification campaigns, fighting against the blight of billboards cropping up across Montana's landscape. She became a strong supporter of peace gardens and a Seeds for Peace program in the wake of World War II. She continued her tireless activism until her death in 1962. Using every form of media available to her, she promoted conservation, beautification, participation, and sustainability. With one hand on the hoe and one on the pen, Alma Higgins practiced a lifetime of passionate politics. Her legacy lives on in pockets of green bursting forth from surprising nooks and crannies in Butte, in the remnants of rock gardens on Frost King Mountain, in the diverse activities of garden clubs across the state, and in the scholarship and practice of the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana, even though her name is unknown. Her life is testimony to the fact that one can make a difference by everyday actions. Moreover, it takes action every day to make an enduring difference. Alma Higgins was an undaunted spirit, able to see beyond the scars to the possibilities of Butte's landscape. A reflective gardener, a systematic researcher, a lifelong learner, and an astute political advocate, Alma Higgins is a remarkable example of the power of one woman to create change. Those who continue to struggle for healing and conserving Montana's landscape into the 21st century would do well to embrace Alma's soul and spirit. Thank you, and let me turn it over to another inspirational Montana woman, Carol Williams.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the three remarkable people on the stage for doing this very special book about very special women who lived in a very special city in Montana. My great-grandmother, Emma Bartlett, came to Montana in 1882 with her husband, and she left an ancient culture behind and departed Cornwall, England in 1882 to go on this adventure to Butte, Montana. The earliest human construction in her homeland dated back 6,000 years. The ancients built their monuments in stone, and she remembered all of them, and she marveled at all of them. The land, whose people spanned the Neolithic, Bronze, and Stone Ages, was home to Romans, missionaries, kings, and chieftains. And of course, the Cornish think it was also the home of King Arthur. She came to, throughout the 1880s, the men of Cornwall had mined the nearby deposits of tin and copper. The deep location of the metals so near the sea made the Cornwall mines dangerous and costly, and for that reason, many Cornish people emigrated to Butte for a better time. And my great-grandmother was one of the women who I think helped settle the city by just the sheer nature of her personality and her strength. She was there, brought a baby with her when she came, and then the year that she arrived in Butte, my grandmother was born. They began their home on East Galena, where they would reside for the rest of their lives, and they would be home to 3 generations of Bartlett women. Emma not only devoted herself to her family, but she also dedicated herself to the care of others. When her children were able to care for themselves, she began to work outside the home. She worked as a nursemaid to many children whose fathers were executives of the Anaconda Company. She took a bus from East Mercury Street to the west side of Butte to various employers. In addition to her child care duties, she also took in laundry and boarders. She became a midwife to many of Butte's families, including some of her own daughters, and took great pride in delivering almost all of her own grandchildren. She worked alongside many Butte physicians to provide care during delivery and after, and she used to say when someone was close to delivery, that she was waiting for a full moon because the baby would just come right around the corner. I mostly remember as a child because she lived into her mid-90s, and I remember as a little girl going to her house, and in her late 80s she was still taking in laundry, if you can believe it. And one of the things that I remember the most about her was I can still recall the smell of the Fels-Naphtha soap, the bluing agent, the starch. There were wash tubs and washboards and pressing mangles for linens and clothes. For our family's laundry, there was a large galvanized tub and well-worn washboards, and on the back porch hung a clothes bag filled with dozens of clothespins. Stretching 30 feet into the backyard were rows upon rows of clotheslines upon which frozen white ghosts would dance along the winter wind. The laundry would go from tub to line to mangle and miraculously be folded sparkling and clean, tied with a string, ready to be picked up or taken away to satisfied clients. To the children and grandchildren of those women, hard work and overcoming difficult circumstances became the norm. Through her determination, Emma taught 3 generations the necessity and value of hard work, and she was doing it in one of the hardest working cities in America. Thank you.
So we'll see you in 10 minutes with Pat Williams and a cast of thousands.
Welcome back to our celebration of Butte in literature, art, and film. It's my pleasure now to introduce Pat Williams, who will preside over the continuation of our program. Pat Williams needs very little introduction, either in Butte or Missoula. He was our congressman for 9 terms, a most eloquent supporter of culture and education and other causes dear to us. For the last several years, he has served as senior fellow in the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West at the University of Montana, teaching, writing, lecturing, and in general, helping us all to celebrate, to better understand, and to care for this special place in which we live. Pat, I'm sure some of you have seen, is among the walking wounded this evening. I was told that he had an accident taking the garbage out this morning. I'm not buying it, Pat. But we're delighted that you're here. Pat's a trooper, a man of courage, and we've all known that all along. And we really appreciate his coming to preside over this session for us. Pat Williams.
Yeah, the story I've been telling around is that in emptying the garbage this morning, I saw a piece of paper that had blown on our lawn, and I bent over to pick it up and fell headlong into a large rock, a landscape rock that we have on the lawn, and dislocated my shoulder and tore a lot of ligaments. That's the story that I've been using. The truth is they've got to start making those bar stools at the M&M shorter. I want to back up and read you a couple of sentences from that book we're celebrating, Mother Lode, about women in Butte. Carol and I collaborated on some of this. Butte was masculine. The muscled sinews of the gallows frames, the boarding and flop houses, the 7 belching stacks of the never sweat, the granite hill with its veins of rough metal. In Butte, the living was high. Men exchanged their paydays for raucous nights. The city in those early years was about hard work and hard play. Men gave scant thought to family stability, neighborhood, or community. In Butte, in its earliest days, there was an 80% per month turnover in miners. Butte was the most dangerous place on earth to work. Fairly well paid, especially after the men decided to, and women decided to organize together, but exceedingly dangerous. It took a village to mine that copper. And if it hadn't been for women, the world would not have had the copper necessary to fight its wars and string its electricity to our homes and factories and fields. An industry cannot sustain the kind of turnover and raucous behavior that was in Butte before women settled it. I was, my grandfather was named Pat. He worked in those mines, and he told a story about coming along down a drift, and suddenly there was a collapse above him. And it was back in the days when the apex laws hadn't quite been settled, and various mining companies, until it was all consolidated in Anaconda, weren't sure where the drifts were, one above the other. One company might be mining this drift following this vein of ore, and another company right above them following another drift. And my grandfather was working along, and there was a collapse, and they saw what they thought was a large boulder come down through the ceiling. But it turned out to be another miner who had been working above them, and they didn't realize how close they were. And my grandfather said after the dust had cleared and the miner was getting up, dusting himself off, he said, I said to him, my grandfather was from Ireland, I said to him, love of God, man, where did you come from? He said, the fellow said, Dublin. I was, yeah, there's some kind of simple humor about that that's very real in there. I was working on top I was a day laborer working on top, and occasionally I'd go down in a cage with my partner, a guy named Duffy Varner, who on his first day as a miner, not a day laborer with me, but as a miner, got crushed to death going down in the mines. So it was dangerous in all of our lifetimes. Right? So the lifetime of everyone here, it's been a dangerous place. I was down, I think, in the Lex, and there was an alderman up in Walkerville named Spud Murphy. And Spud he was an alderman, but he was also a shift boss, one of the, in the mines, and he had gotten me my job. I know it's a shocking realization to hear that there was political patronage in Butte, but Spud got me my job, and so anyhow, several of us, Duffy and I and a couple other guys, are down this drift, and Spud had an unmistakable accent, and I heard it coming down the drift. He was looking for me. He yelled, "Patrick, Patrick, is you down there?" I knew it was him. I couldn't see him, but I said, "Yeah, Mr. Murphy, I'm down here." He said, "How many of you are there?" I said, "3 of us." He said, "Half of you come up." I told that story at a Democratic banquet in Butte 20 years ago, and the tables, the 10 top tables, the 10 people at the table. I was down in the old Copper King hotel and dining area, and there was a little fuss after I said it, and a guy stood up, an old guy stood up, and he said, "Give me that mic, Patrick." It was one of those movable mics. And so I went over to him, and I peeled the ears away, and it was Spud. It was Spud Murphy. And he was on shaky legs. He was holding on to the back of his daughter's chair, I remember, and he said, "I just wanted you all to know that the story that our good congressman tells you is the truth." He said, "What he doesn't tell you is that when I said half of you come up, half of them did." Maybe one more, because it wouldn't be a Butte night without a couple of stories, would it? I belonged in the Congress to a group called the Friends of Ireland. It was started by former Speaker, the great late Tip O'Neill. And Ireland, I don't know why folks don't know this. The Irish don't talk about it, so nobody knows it. Ireland neither asks for nor will accept American foreign aid. They don't get foreign aid. They won't take it. So we started a group, Tip started a group called the Friends of Ireland. We started a separate trust and endowment that is funded privately and helps small business over there and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of Yankee dollars in it. But we get some money from the bread stew to help out. And yeah, well, not much, but we get some. And so we're over there, and my wife Carol was there, and Tip's wife Millie, and they had a wonderful reception for us. The Irish don't need much of an excuse to have a party, and so they had a great reception for us in the president's home. And there probably in this great hall were, I don't know, 500 people. And so Master of Ceremonies was going to ask Tip to say a few words, but when he got everybody's attention, he said, "Now, which one of you congressional lads is from Butte?" And I was standing next to Tip, and he looked, Tip was 6'4", 6'5" or something. He looked down at me, he said, "Oh God, we're in trouble now." And I said, "I am." And so here's the story he told. He said, "Well, we understand over here that you have a daredevil that comes from Butte named Abel Knievel." And he said, "We just want you to know that you Americans, as much as we love you, you have nothing on us Irish. We too have a daredevil. We call him Haile O'Reilly." And he said it was just 2 weeks ago that Heine did his stunts to a packed house down here at the huge grand stadium. And he said, so as not to be trying to imitate your daredevil, what Heine does is he jumps motorcycles with a double-decker bus. Well, he said, we wish you could have been there. He said, we built a great ramp up the side of the stadium, up clear to the outer wall, up where the seats are and the people sit. And he said Heine was in his bus, revving it up, and down on the field at the end of the ramp were 27 motorcycles. And he said he revved it up, and then he pushed the brake forward, and he said down he came. It was a grand sight. Speeding ever faster and faster, and finally he left the ramp, and he had crossed half of the motorcycles, and some damn fool rang the bus, and he had to stop and let him go. And then one more and I'll stop. My grandma, this is not a funny story. My grandma, as my grandpa, my grandma's name was Lizzie Keogh, and this chapter that Carol and I collaborated on, part of it is about Lizzie Keogh, who came to this country before her teens with her dad, and they left Mom and the rest of the children at home. As so often happened, my grandma being the oldest, so they would work and then bring the rest of the family. By the way, only a year or so after my grandmother Lizzie and her father Jim came to this country, my grandma's mommy, as she called her, passed away from pneumonia, and the children were scattered. And there's some grand stories about a reunion, but my purpose to this final story is to tell you that my grandma would gather the grandkids around her in her little living room on Woolman Street in Butte. And there'd be Tony and Nikki and Bobby and myself. Bobby, by the way, Bobby is Evel Knievel. Bobby, Evel's real name is Bobby, and Bobby and I kind of grew up together almost as brothers in my grandma's house. But we'd sit around, and my grandma would bring out a bundle from the bottom of her chest, the very chest that they brought over from Ireland. And, the Irish are great for storytelling and history, and so this would happen about once every 2 or 3 years, and each time she would do it as if she'd never done it before. She'd slowly untie the 2 knots, carefully done knots, and lay out the 4 corners of a shawl. And then inside that Irish medicine bundle, she had, to her, valuables, including a concertina, a little hand organ that my daddy played on the ship over the waters. And then she'd set each item aside, and when she'd finally get to the shawl, she'd pick it up, and her hands would quiver, and her chin would quiver, and she would begin to well up, as if it was the first time she was remembering this, or the first time we had heard it. And she would say, and children, this is the very shawl that my mommy took off of her shoulders at the dock and put around mine and said, there you go, Lizzie, in case you get cowed on the boat. She said, and then she slowly tied 1 knot, and then slowly tied that second goodbye knot, patted me on the head, and looking at my father, she said, now remember, Lizzie, when you get to the New World, don't stop in America. you go straight to Butte, Montana. Thank you. We have a grand end of the evening for you. I think you will agree. And our first reader is Michael Punk, who's a former partner in a Washington, D.C. law firm. His professional experience includes work on both Capitol Hill and in the White House, in the National Security Council. He is the author of a novel, The Revenant, a Spur Award finalist, and more recently of Fire and Brimstone, the North Butte mine disaster of 1917. Michael lives in Missoula now, which isn't quite, I can verify, close to Butte, close enough to Butte, but Michael, you're getting there. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Punk.
Thanks very much, Pat. I appreciate the introduction. Since I'm not from Butte, and since I am from Missoula, I thought I would start off tonight with a short story about Butte and Missoula. And it has to do, it took place 3 years ago, which was when I first started doing research for this book, Fire and Brimstone. And I needed to go down and get a license plate for my truck, and I went down to the courthouse. And as you all know, in Montana, we have a wide array of choices when it comes to license plates. And I was kind of standing there, looking up, trying to decide which plate I was going to get. And I saw this head frame, this Butte plate. And I thought, well, gosh, that'd be a kind of a neat plate. I like the way that head frame looks. And since I'm doing this work on Butte, it would be appropriate to have this plate. And so I got the Butte plate, and I put it on my truck, and I drove home. And I got out of my truck, and my neighbor walked up to me with this kind of quizzical look on his face. And he said, what's with the Butte plate? And I said, well, you know, I'm doing this book on Butte and going over there a lot and learning about all this stuff, and I thought it'd be kind of neat to have that plate. And he said, well, gosh, he said, I don't know what people in Missoula are going to think about that. And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, should I be worried? I mean, is somebody going to slash my tire or something? And he said, no. He said, no. He said, if they think you're from Butte, they'd be too afraid that you'd kick their ass. So it was a little insight for me about the relationship between Butte and Missoula. Well, not being from Butte, one of the things I'm supposed to be able to tout here tonight is objectivity. Unlike all of the Butte hotheads, I'm supposed to have a kind of dispassionate perspective on the place, kind of give, I don't know, anthropological analysis from 30,000 feet or something like that. Well, I'm here to tell you tonight that I'm a failure at dispassionate analysis. And in the context of Butte, in fact, I don't think it's possible. Certainly, dispassionate analysis does not teach us the lessons that Butte has to teach. My perspective on Butte, as Pat mentioned, began 3 years ago when I started doing research on this book about the Granite Mountain speculator mining disaster of 1917. 163 men died, at least 163 men died in that disaster, and to this day it's the worst hard rock mining disaster in U.S. history. And what I thought I would do tonight is to talk about the disaster itself, how it began, and what happened there in Butte that day. And then talk a little bit about why it is that disasters have this singular power to captivate our interest. And then to draw out the lessons that I've learned about Butte in part, but I think lessons that are more transcendent than that. The North Butte mining disaster, the Granite Mountain speculator disaster, began ironically as an effort to improve the safety of the Granite Mountain shaft. They were installing a sprinkler system. And if the fire that killed those men on June 8, 1917 had happened a week later, they might have been able to put it out by turning a valve. They were installing the sprinkler system up and down the 3,600 feet of this shaft. And the way that this began is on the morning of June 8th, a cable crew arrived at work at the Granite Mountain shaft. And one of the last things left to do before this sprinkler system was operational was to move an electrical generator that was 2,600 feet below the surface. They wanted to move the generator away from the wood-timbered shaft where it could cause a fire and put it further inside of the workings where it would be surrounded by stone. But in order to move it, they needed to rewire it. And rewiring it meant lowering a 1,200-foot section of electrical cable. And this cable was 5 inches in diameter, and each 1-foot section of it weighed 5 pounds, so the whole cable weighed 6,000 pounds. And it took them almost the entire day to lower this thing to where the bottom end was at the same level of this crosscut that they wanted to feed it into. And just as they got it down to that level, they realized that there was a kink in this cable, kind of like the kink you would get on a telephone cord, for any of you who don't have cordless phones now. The kind of kink we used to get in telephone cords. And they decided that before they threaded this cable into this crosscut, they would try and get the kink out of this 1,200-foot cable. And their idea for the way to get that kink out was to loosen the lower bindings that held the cable to the hoist. And some guy crawled up there and loosened some of those bindings. And when they loosened those bindings, the cable began to slip. And then it began to fall. And then it was in a free fall. And 1,200 feet, 6,000 pounds of cable came crashing down the Granite Mountain shaft. And it crashed all the way down until it got to the 2,400-foot level, where it coiled up in this giant mass. Well, that crew was done for the day, and they knew it, and they went up to the surface. And the night crew was about to come on shift, the graveyard shift. And their job for the night was to go down into the shaft on the hoist to a point that was just above that mass of cable, find the end of it, attach the hoist to it, and pull it out, because of course the cable had been ruined. Now there's something important that you need to know about this cable, and it's something that I learned from a guy named Al Hooper, who a lot of you who are from Butte probably knew. Unfortunately, he died a few months ago. Al Hooper told me how, when he was a boy, he and his friends used to go around the mine sites in Butte and pick up pieces, scrap of this cable, just like the one that had fallen in the Granite Mountain mine that night. And they would turn it in to recycling centers and get money for the copper that was inside of it. But before they could do that, they had to first of all take their penknives and scrape off the external layer of that cable, which in that era, in an industrial setting, was made out of lead to protect the cable. So they would scrape away the lead. And after they did that, what that revealed was the internal insulation, which was made out of oil-soaked cloth. The way that they got rid of that oil-soaked cloth was they'd throw the section of wire down on the ground, they'd light a match, and they'd toss the match on it. And Al Hooper said it would virtually explode. It was so flammable. So that's what was sitting down there in that mine, 6,000 feet of this cable, when the night crew went down to try and pull it out just before midnight on June 8th, 1917. In those days, even though flashlights, electric flashlights, had been invented for more than 10 years, they were still using open-flame carbide lanterns. And I think you can see where this is going. As one of the miners was searching in the darkness, hanging out from the hoist cage, 2,400 feet below ground, but still 1,200 feet from the bottom of the shaft, he's hanging out from the edge of this cage, and that flame from his carbide lantern came in contact with that mass of cable, and it virtually exploded. It was so flammable. In a matter of instants, that cable, all 1,200 feet, was on fire, and of course that cable fire spread instantly to the wood-timbered shaft, chemically treated wooden timbers of the shaft. And in minutes, the whole thing was aflame. The newspaper accounts of the day said it was like a giant torch. There were 400 men who were working below ground that night in the immediate vicinity of the place where the fire took place. And as people from Butte know, that's not just one shaft that sinks down into the ground. Not only was there the Granite Mountain shaft, but there was its sister shaft, the Speculator. And connecting the Granite Mountain and the Speculator was a ladder-like series of crosscuts. And branching out on every level were the drifts and stopes where the miners followed the vein of the ore. And there were manways. And in addition to all of those passageways, in just those two mines, there were surrounding mines. And all of those surrounding mines were connected into this system of underground tunnels. What killed the miners, most of the miners that night, was not the fire, although the fire did kill some. What killed most of the miners is the thing that kills most miners in mine fires, carbon monoxide. And through that underground labyrinth, this poisonous gas began to seep through the workings. And it mixed with other gases so that the miners could smell it, and in some cases even taste it as they ran. 400 men that night, desperately seeking to survive. And as Pat mentioned, most of them don't know very much at all about the mine that they're working in. 80% a month turnover rates. The only way that most of those men knew out of the mine was the way that they came into the mine when they started their shift. And that passageway was burning. And so what the men were left with was basically each other and the hope that someone down there with them knew a way out. A lot of what I talk about in my book is 3 groups of miners who made the incredible decision that there was no way out and that their best hope for survival was to actually go deeper into the mine and to find a place where the air was still pure, and then to throw up a jury-rigged bulkhead and to stuff it with mud and with their clothing, and then to sit back there and hope that it was airtight and that the carbon monoxide would not come in, and that the rescuers would reach them before the gas did. That's the essence to me of the human drama that is at the center of this story of the North Butte disaster. In doing research about this disaster and in thinking a lot about disasters, I've asked myself why it is that we're so fascinated with disaster. And part of the answer, I think, if we're honest, is that it's kind of voyeuristic. And it's as base as reality TV. Disaster is dramatic, and it's interesting to see how people deal with extreme situations and extreme circumstances, life and death circumstances. And so we watch these disasters unfold. In a sense, we can't turn away. Part of the answer as to why we're interested in disaster, though, I hope is a little bit more noble than that. I think that one of the things disaster does is that it strips away everything else, and it leaves the essence of the people who are faced with those horrible situations, with those horrible circumstances. And it tells us a lot about those people, and it tells us a lot about the communities that they come from. We're living in a time today in which we've seen our own share of disasters. 9/11, tsunami, Hurricane Katrina. This year, unfortunately, we've seen mine disasters again in our country, and we've come to know the names of places like Sago and Tallsmanville. What does the Granite Mountain Speculator disaster teach us about Butte, and what does it teach us about those disasters of our own time? I want to give you a couple of snapshots and let the people of Butte in 1917 tell you what it teaches us. And one of the most haunting things that I found in doing the research for this book was a folder in a dusty box in the basement of the archives, the state archives in Helena, Montana. And it was filled with the original telegrams and letters that had been sent by family members of miners in Butte, writing to the mine and asking about their loved ones, desperately seeking information about whether they were alive or dead. And one of the women who sent one of those telegrams was the mother of a man named James D. Moore, who led a group of men to safety in a bulkhead below the mine, in the depths of the mine, although James D. Moore himself would end up dying. And in this first telegram that his mother sends on June 9th, the day after the disaster, She says simply, "Is James D. Moore all right? Answer immediately, my expense." And in looking at this folder, you could feel the angst of a mother who only wants to know if her son is okay in the context of this horrible thing that's happening. 6 days later, she sent a second telegram to the North Butte Mining Company. And unfortunately, by then, she knew that her son had been killed. And this is what she said. She said, "If my son, James D. Moore, left letters for mother, sister Lee, or Ben, kindly send me copies of same by mail. Let me know cost of same and we'll send you money. If you left above letters, wire yes at my expense." She sought one last word from her son to salve the wound. And indeed, her son did write a letter as he sat behind that bulkhead, as the hours wore on, and as the men began to wonder whether or not rescue would come. And in fact, most of the miners who were trapped behind those bulkheads were thinking about their family members. And instead of thinking about themselves, were seeking to give some type of word that they could leave behind that would provide comfort to their families. And this is what James D. Moore wrote. He wrote, "You will know your Jim died like a man, and his last thought was for his wife that I love better than anyone on earth. We will meet again. Tell mother and the boys goodbye. With love to my pet, and may God take care of you. Your loving Jim." There was another miner that night, a miner with whom a lot of you are familiar. He's a hero in Butte, for good reason. His name is Manus Dugan. And Manus Dugan would also write a letter to his loved ones that night, and this is what his letter said. He said, "To my dear wife and mother, it breaks my heart to be taken from you so suddenly and unexpectedly. But think not of me, for if death comes, it will be in a sleep without suffering. I ask for forgiveness for any suffering or pain I have ever caused. Madge, dear, the place is for you and the child. Manus." When the Sago disaster happened in last January, this year, a couple of weeks after those miners died, there was a newspaper story that they had been found with letters. And it was utterly and completely haunting to read those letters that those miners in January of 2006 had written to their loved ones. And I'll read you a couple of short passages from those letters from this year. A 51-year-old mine foreman named Martin Toller Jr. wrote that, "Tell all I will see them on the other side. I love you. It wasn't bad. I just went to sleep." Randall McCloy wrote, "Anna, I love you so much. To my son, trust in the Lord. To my daughter, stay sweet. I am not that afraid. Don't grieve long. I want you to be happy in life." It's amazing to me that the words from 2006 are almost exactly the same as those words from 1917. And it's clear that the underlying humanity that exists even in the context of disaster is unchanged in 90 years. Randall McCloy, who wrote that last letter that I just read from, would be the only man in that Sago bulkhead to survive. And his family, along with the other families of Sago, did what the families in Butte did in 1917 in the face of disaster, which is to say that they poured into the churches of Butte, seeking solace, seeking some word of comfort. And you can imagine the incredibly difficult task that the clergymen in Butte in 1917 had as they faced their parishioners and sought to come up with some type of word that would provide some type of solace. And of all the documents that I found in connection with the research for this book, there was nothing that I thought provided more profound, more transcendental hope in the midst of disaster than this sermon that was delivered in Butte in 1917 by a man named Reverend Lawrence A. Wilson. And I'm going to read you a short bit from his sermon. It took him a while to find an argument. He was struggling. You could tell that he was trying to come up with something, and you could tell that he wasn't doing a very good job at first. The first thing that he said to his congregation was, "Remember that disasters are the exception rather than the rule." I have a sense that that probably rang pretty hollow in the context of this horrible situation that they were in. And then he told his parishioners that maybe some good will come of this. Maybe this disaster will prevent other like disasters from happening in the future. And I have a sense that that also rang hollow, because although the North Butte disaster was Butte's worst, it was not Butte's first. And I think the people who were sitting there that day knew that it would not be the last. But then Reverend Wilson hit upon what I think was truly profound, and he said this. He said, "But see the higher laws at work. Humanity is again vindicated. Here is a man rushing back into the gas and flame to rescue a comrade. Here are the intrepid helmet men, defying death every time they enter a shaft. Here is the great-hearted city of Butte, athrob with sympathy and tenderness." And at that point, I imagined that he had his congregation's attention. And he saved his best line for last. This is what he said. He said, "Do you not see God here?" Now that is a terribly profound and hopeful message to come from the midst of disaster. And it says an awful lot about the city of Butte. I'm not from Butte, but I'm very grateful for the 3 years that I've had the privilege of studying it. There remains much to be mined in Butte. Thank you very much.
Within the underground sediments, the many layers of Butte run great veins of riches, and I'm not referring now to the dirt and the copper and the other metals, but rather the layers of Butte's history. A city as profound and varied, as important as Butte, needs artists to uncover, to mine that history. And among the kinds of artists it needs are poets. Mark Gibbons, who lives here in Missoula with his wife and 2 sons, is a poet. He's a poet in the schools of Missoula with the Missoula Writing Collaborative. His poems have appeared in Cutbank, Talking River Review, the Midwest Quarterly, the Comstock Review, and Rattle. His full-length collection of poems, Connemara Moonshine, appeared in 2002. Please greet Mark Gibson.
Thank you. I'm really glad that Michael Punk is not from Butte, because I'm not from Butte either, and I thought, geez, what the hell am I doing up here? There are all these people celebrating Butte. But I do have a connection to Butte. My grandparents immigrated to this country in 1917, and my grandfather and my grandmother's little brother came to Montana. And they were supposed to be going down to Beaverhead County and get a job on a sheep ranch, because that's what they knew how to do. And then they would make enough money and bring over my grandmother and my 18-month-old uncle at the time, and my grandmother, who was pregnant with my father in Ireland, in Galway. And so anyway, they got to Beaverhead County, and they got in with the sheep for a while, but my grandfather had heard all about Butte. And so my uncle, being considerably younger, he kind of took him under his wing and said, "We're going to Butte." And they went to Butte and got jobs in the mines, which maybe they made money faster, I don't know, but they brought my grandmother over, and she was not a woman that was excited about Butte or about mining, either one. She grew up in the Connemara district, and her dad was a a fisherman there, and she loved the outdoors. And anyway, this first poem that I thought that I would read kind of relates to that experience. And so this poem is for my grandmother, Delia Joyce Gibbons, and for my friend Ed Leahy. Okay, Ghost Town. You want to drive Excelsior to see the real Butte. Hang a left on Montana. Take in mercury, iron, platinum, and silver on your way up the hill to Walkerville. Walk to the Granite Mountain Mine Memorial. Touch the head frame. Read your Uncle Tommy Joyce's name carved there. One of 162 immigrant miners who died in the Speculator Mine disaster 1 month to the day before your father was born in that third-floor flat corner of Montana and Quartz into your grandmother's burning grief. Guilt finally turns cold as stone. Is a child born to a ghost more or less a man? That young Bridget, your grandmother, watched for a month from her window the daily funerals at the First Presbyterian Church, kept keening and packing your grandfather's lunch pail for his graveyard shift underground. She'd lie in bed and listen for the sound of the sirens heading up the hill, hold her rosary, her dead brother's photograph, and the child Vincent twisting inside, already ready for a drink. None of it matters now. All of them gone where they belong, in the fallen brick and plaster of abandoned buildings, the vacant sound of no traffic on Park or Broadway, and wind that chases, pushes, teases your hat down empty alleys past rusted garbage cans. I have a couple more I want to read. I want to read this one. It's a little bit different. It's a different character. It's a guy I knew from Butte, but he was a cowboy. And one of the things I do or have done over for a few years now is move people's household goods around, and so I wrote this poem about this fella I met, an old cowboy named Leo Jarvis. And so this is for Leo and Anna and John. It's called No Half-Cocked Cowboy Move. The old cowboy was all gussied up, boots shined, best Stetson, and a western sport coat. He sat mute out of the way on a kitchen chair, looking nervous, embarrassed, and confused as a steer in a corral full of heifers. His head ducked slightly down, pulled up shy each time we passed, lugging his furniture and boxes, the reminders of his life. He'd nod, finger his bolo tie, dab at the end of his nose with a handkerchief pulled from his hip pocket. Restless, meaty hands skittered and danced along the crook of his cane. We were moving him out of an apartment into his daughter's ground-level house. It was part of the job, but I didn't feel right invading his underwear drawer to get a better grip lifting his dresser. We grabbed a pile of dirty linen, his pajamas on the bedroom floor. I found a loaded pistol tucked under the mattress. We stripped it bare, cleaned down to the stained glass stallion that hung in the window. He waited, watched us, and didn't watch. His eyes looked far away. Will James jumped out of the nightstand drawer, and I stuffed him back inside. We were almost done, had to set up the bed, when I caught him eyeballing me, craning his neck to see how his life would be arranged. I said, "Moving's sure fun, ain't it?" He reacted quick as a cutting horse. "I told him to just leave everything," he said. "Hell, I don't need this stuff. You know, when I was packing in the sawtooths for hunters and dudes, I only had one camp stool, and all I did was walk around it." When we were done, his daughter offered us a beer, and the old cowboy erupted with tales of cow dogs, roundups, latigos, and dallies. In one day, we branded and docked and inoculated a couple of 100 head. Charlie Russell and Will Rogers were alive. He said, "I got those Navajo rugs from a custom saddle maker outside of Mackay, Idaho." Showed us a pair of buffalo hide chaps that belonged to one of his wives. Small woman, kid-sized, but she could rope and ride good as any man. Later, she ran off with a bull rider from Melrose, which was fine by me. I figured he did me a favor. That little gal plumb wore me out. My partner and I laughed, but stood up to leave. Truth was, we were still on the clock. We finished the beer. The old cowboy wasn't through. And I was a fair hand in those days, but a lot of brush has growed up in the corral since I drove range cows and wrangled wild horses. Now I'm just glad to be close to the stove. We shook hands all around. It was time to go. His lingo still glows in my veins. Next time you're in our neck of the woods, we'll rustle up a jigger or two of something stronger than beer. And I'll tell you the story how her mother and me broke in those Indian saddle blankets one cold September scouting trip, snowed in up on Chilkoot Pass. Thank you. So I'm going to read this last poem, and it's sort of the title poem for this book, and I don't know what else to say about it other than I did take it to a workshop one time over at the university, and one of the leaders, the professors there, tried to help me do something with it, untangle it, and cut the crap out of it, and it never worked. So I told her we just should give up on it and let it be whatever it wants to be. And so this is it. It's called Connemara Moonshine. The worn luggage of my Irish ancestors sits in the darkest chamber of my heart, stacked dusty, unhinged, but never unpacked. And when I listen alone, holding my breath, I hear whispers calling from trunk to glen, uprisings, green as the 12 bins and cool as moonshine on Lake Connemara, March evenings when no one knows. My grandfather said his daily prayers in Gaelic, away from the church. His fingers worked the rosary beads he hung above his bed, just over his head, blood lucky as an ocean of ale. Adrift in my shanty ship of fool dreams, blue drunk on a frozen sea, this legacy of liquid terror and pride is stuck between absolute zero and steam, tears cold in my burning veins. Insane messengers of impending doom, bottles of Bushmills, smooth as gasoline, comfort the combustible marriage between Jesus and the devil himself in my mind. If the bottle's half full, I'm only half empty. but no, my rage will go wrong. So I'll drink till ice ignites the song, burning hotter than the fires of hell in my gut, and cry, for the love of Jesus H, suffer in Christ. What the f am I supposed to do? Just one more time, I'll try to hide like a leprechaun circus bear. Do you suppose he's happy behind the bars, tipping bottles and dancing in clothes? I must dry the blind Madonna's eyes, pack my bags for Butte and go. Decide to be my mother's son, and know my father's moon will rise once more, St. Patrick's Day. Thank you very much.
Pat and Mike owned a farm in County Cork, and they grew hay, and the county decided it needed a new road, and the road was going to dissect their hay field, and so Pat and Mike sold the property to the county, and the county agreed to put an underpass on it to facilitate Pat and Mike getting from the one field they owned now to the other field they owned. And one hot day during mowing season, they were pulling the wagon. They were clear down on the south end of the field. They wanted to get to the other side, and Pat said to Michael, he said, there's no sense going clear up to that overpass. Let's just pull it across the road right here. We'll do it quickly. And they were in the middle of the road, went around the corner and up over the hill, aimed right at him. Came an American in his new European sports car. He had a choice. He could plow into the wagon, endangering not only himself, but surely Pat and Mike, or he could spin down in the barrel pit, and of course he opted to do that, and his tire got caught, and the car flipped once, twice out in the field, exploded in a ball of fire, and incinerated the American. And Pat said, my God, Michael, did you see that? Why, we got out of that field just in time. The Irish can tell those stories about Irish. The rest of you cannot tell those stories. I'm Irish. Pam, now we're going to hear from two people that are responsible for the film. Pam Roberts co-founded Rattlesnake Productions, Inc., a nonprofit dedicated to producing film and videos. Roberts has produced and directed a number of award-winning documentary films and videos for public television and for national and international theatrical and video distribution, including Backbone of the World, The Blackfeet, produced with Blackfoot director George Bordeaux, and co-directed Ishi, The Last Yahi, a one-hour documentary broadcast nationally on American Experience, and a one-hour documentary with Connie Poteen, Contrary Warriors, the story of the Crow tribe. That was nationally broadcast as well on A&E and PBS. Currently in post-production, Roberts is now producing and directing The Richest Hill on Earth, the saga of an American mining town. Ed Daub is a contributing editor of Harper's. He's a visiting lecturer at UC Berkeley in California, where he teaches at the Graduate School of Journalism. He is the head writer for this documentary film about Butte, and is also writing a book on the subject. Please welcome Pam and Ed.
Thanks, Pat. It's always great to be back at the Wilma. And I'm not from Butte either, but for the last 8 years, I can always say I'm with him. He's from Butte. And when I first thought about making this film, I knew immediately I would have to have a really good writer, and that writer would have to be from Butte. And I read a wonderful article that Jim referred to earlier called Pennies from Hell, which Ed had written for Harper's. And I thought for sure he's living in New York or someplace like that, and I could never work one-on-one with him. Well, as it turned out, he had just come back home to Montana to live, and I had just come back home. And that was 8 years ago, and we're still friends. Best friends. I'm going to limit my remarks because this is clearly an event that is honoring Montana writers, and I want the light to shine a little brighter on Ed tonight. He deserves it. He never wanted to do this in the first place. I talked him into it. He begged, he pleaded. I used all my best tone producer skills and reeled him back in. And so I'm really happy that he is the lead writer. We couldn't be doing it without him. I just want to say a couple things real quickly. I want to thank Montana Committee for Humanities. They have always been there for Rattlesnake Productions since the very beginning. And I want to thank them on behalf of the independent film community because they support independent filmmaking, and not that many people do. And it's absolutely critical. We wouldn't be up here today if it weren't for their kind of support. Montana Arts Council and Montana Committee for Humanities really make films like this possible because you build that base support in your home state, and then you can go out other places and raise national money. And I need to thank Pat because I know he had a hand in our production grant that we got from National Endowment for Humanities, and I've never publicly thanked him, and I want to do that. I also need to thank Ellen Crain and a group of wonderful Butte women who went to our rescue at the 11th hour. We needed $70,000 in matching, and those women allowed me to raise that $70,000 in Butte in a matter of days. So we wouldn't be here if it weren't for them either. I'm going to limit my comments to those which underscore the importance of good writing for a film like this. A good film requires 3 basic ingredients: good story, strong characters, and conflict. Everyone that has been up here tonight knows that the Butte experience provides all of these elements in spades 10 times over. Therein lies our probably most challenging parts of making this film in the writing. We have to make a film which covers about 100 years of history. We have to do it in 1 hour. We have to make it historically factual, and at the same time we have to make it poetic. Not an easy thing to do, and the writing is very important to that whole process. People sometimes ask how I came to this project, and I really, the project came to me, the film came to me. I was trying to convince a friend to shoot in Butte. They were making a feature film. And as many of you know, visually, Butte is a filmmaker's dream because of the cultural, of the mining artifacts and the landscape. And at the end of the day, after I'd done the scouting, I went up to the Granite Mountain Memorial that Michael talked about, I think, and some of the other folks. And I was looking out over this vast, magnificent, ravaged mindscape at the time of the day in Butte when that light is absolutely exquisite. I don't know what it is about Butte, the altitude or the time of the day or the time of the year, but it was just amazing. And I knew at that moment that was my next film. And I'm simultaneously thrilled and terrified at the same time. I was thrilled about the potential, but terrified because of the sheer scale and immensity of the story. And that I knew at that moment that it was going to be a very long process. not only in terms of getting a handle on the story, but just trying to raise the money necessary to do justice, to pull off this project and tell the kind of story that I wanted to tell. Ed's going to talk a little bit more about that, and then we're going to show a clip of the film. It's not even really a clip, it's just some selects that we took out of a rough cut, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. But I did want to say one thing about the film. There's a lot of things that can be said about the story, but in the end, it's my hope that the film touches people the way that Butte has touched me, and that it will serve to raise questions about extractive industry and the sacrifices that are made in the name of that, both human and environmental sacrifices. At the end of the day, despite all the challenges and the heartaches and the lack of money, and it's been 8 years now for us, we're still at it, we're almost there. I can always say without hesitation that it's been a privilege to be able to make this film. I have wonderful friends in Butte. Ed is one of them, but I have many. And so my good friend has been with me on this journey, and as Jim said, he's a fine, fine writer, and I'm privileged to work with him and privileged to have him for a friend. So, Ed?
I'm going to keep my remarks brief as well, because we really do want to focus the spotlight on the film. But I will confirm what Pam said when she called me to suggest talking about working on the film together. My first reaction was absolutely not. I prefer to work alone, and I'm, in the privacy and solitude of my little shanty on the hill in East Walkerville. I'm the tyrant of my own text, and that's the role I'm most comfortable with. But what I've learned in this process is that some surprising and very, very beneficial things come out of the collaborative process, and filmmaking couldn't be more collaborative. So what you are going to see tonight, although Pam and I are standing up here representing it, we've certainly carried the project through from the beginning, is the work of many people over a long period of time. Regarding the pieces that you're going to see, as Pam said, they're selects, which means that you're going to see, I think, 3 discrete pieces that have been pulled out of a rough cut. We're in post-production now. We're editing, we're writing narration, we're locating and securing the imagery we want to use, the archival footage and still photographs. So what you're going to see when I say rough, I mean temporary sound, temporary music when there is music, temporary narration by one of the producers, not the person who actually will do the narration. You'll also see some temporary imagery that we've dropped in. And I might just add that one of the reasons why the process has taken so long is because Pam, from the beginning, insisted on shooting on Super 16 millimeter film, which I believe was the right decision, but it's much more expensive all through the entire process. And it will pay off eventually because it's just going to look gorgeous, and it really will do justice to the visual qualities of Butte, especially the mining and old urban landscape. But what you're going to see tonight is a projected video, so the quality as well of the selects won't be nearly as stunning as the final film. I might say just by way of saying what we've tried to do is in this film, simply stated, is to pay tribute to the miners, the workers, the work that was done, the working class culture, the community that developed around the work. Butte is distinctive in many ways, and one of the most important is that it's the only mining camp in the West that didn't dry up and blow away. The story of mining in the West, or the legacy, the signature of mining in the West is, a ghost town and ravaged landscape. Butte persisted and kept persisting, decade in and decade out. And certainly there were difficult times, but it actually persisted for a long enough time that you actually saw the development of a community, an urban industrial culture that stayed long enough to become conscious of itself and create a kind of mythology around itself and a wish to perpetuate itself. So we wanted very much this to be a human story in the sense of focusing on the people and the work that was done in Butte. But we also wanted to put that in context, and it becomes more important as time goes by that there be a context for the Butte experience, because if you look at it piecemeal, or if you look at Butte today, it's very easy to come to the wrong conclusions about what happened there and why, or to come to any conclusion at all. I mean, for first-time people arriving in Butte, it can be forbidding, bizarre, but ultimately it's kind of a mystery. What happened there and why? So we wanted to put Butte in context. And that meant showing how Butte was part of the industrialization of America, the complete transformation of American life that occurred in the late 19th century and the 20th century, and the same sort of transformation that's going on across the globe today. And one of the ironies of Butte today is that we do have a mine, an operating small open pit mine. And the reason it is operating is because of the incredibly rapid pace of industrialization that's going on in China. China, in a sense, is going through what we went through 100 years ago. So we want to do both of those. So we're necessarily painting with pretty broad brushstrokes, but again, focusing on people and the drama of everyday lives and the stories that people had to tell about their own experience and their family experiences to keep it emotionally accessible. What we've chosen in the selects are primarily pieces that focus on characters. That's the most compelling stuff we have now in terms of where we are in production. It's also the easiest to sort of capture and show in short bits. What we're not providing tonight is the context, and I just wanted to stress that the focus on the character's experience, both good and bad, is going to be delivered tonight without too much context, too much delving into why it happened, what were the consequences, should we do it again, what does this all mean, this huge urban industrial experiment that we're engaged in, and the extraordinarily voracious way we're going about using natural resources, those sorts of things. They are part of the film. They will not be part of what you see tonight. We're going to primarily show you some of our characters and get at maybe some of that, what Swain talked about earlier, that sort of working man's grace. I think that's one of the things that will come through in these pieces that we're going to screen tonight. So, yeah. The other thing that Pam would want to mention is, for some of you, the sound varies. I'm not a filmmaker, but as I understand it, at the end of this process, post-production process, all the sound will be balanced and even out and clarified, and there's all kinds of technical things that go on towards the end. We haven't had a chance to do any of that with this, so this is exactly what I would not do as a writer. I mean, basically, this is we're showing you a draft, but we're pretty proud of this draft. So hope you enjoy it.
A lot of people ask me, "What did you do?" I said, "I was a hard rock miner in Butte."
naturally, I wanted to be a miner because I'm from Butte. And it's the richest hill on earth.
We thought we lived in the biggest place in the world.
When you tell them there's 10,000 miles of tunnels under Butte, they will not believe you.
I think I have a good garden angel because I didn't know half the time when I left the house that I'd ever return.
The whole city of Butte ran on that hill out
there. There was a rhythm to life by what the mines did, what the sounds were, and what the whistles told you.
My history is just here. We were born to this, the mines.
There were miners from Bisbee and some came from Cork, some from New Jersey and some from New York, and a big belly Dutchman from over the Rhine got a job swinging up in the mountains, Carmine, to the line, to the lean. For how would you like to be me?
When you're down the mine and your partner and your other friends down there, you're like brothers.
You know that by heart now. Let's hear you repeat it.
I saw everybody every day for many years, year in, year out. You knew everybody. It was comradeship, you know. You always had a partner. Working partners, they know exactly what the other guy was thinking. In case there's an accident, you have somebody that's there to go for help.
Butte's mines were statistically the most dangerous in the world, and though that includes the mines of Tsarist Russia, it includes the South African diamond mines.
You know it's bad ground when you walk in there and it's dribbled. It's little rocks is coming down, and then you can tell when you hit it, it's solid, it's good. If it's hollow, it's bad news. You know, I never ever said goodbye in the morning going to work. I'd say, well, see you, so long, tap of life. Never goodbye. When you were grilling and you got ready to fill the holes with dynamite and shoved it in with a loading stick, you tapped her light. And so you didn't hit it too hard and it went off and blow your head off. So that's goodbye. Tap her light.
Every night I said prayers that I would be killed instead of getting crippled. I used to have nightmares, and I still do, of getting crushed, falling down a shaft. One time when we almost got killed, I happened to look up and I seen that timber pulling apart, and I said to my partner, "Let's go, Louie. Time to get out of here." I said, "Stop for nothing or you're going to get run over."
I lost my partner. He was up there when he was drilling. He was just on his own up there, and I guess he had a fast fuse, and that's the worst part about it. When you light it off, and it's gone right now, and it explodes, and it starts the other ones exploding too. It decapitated him. Oh, tore me up. I was sick for a couple of days. I just sick with grief. He was such a good fellow to me. Him and I got along so good. couldn't believe they were really gone. Every single Sunday in the parish church they'd be praying for so-and-so killed in the mines in Butte, Montana. When you hear that, you can imagine how much fear there would be in the hearts of the women.
I went to high school. I was the only one kid in that class that had a father. The rest of them all dead.
In St. Mary's Parish, you had a high proportion of widows, many of whom would do all sorts of things, or maybe even have several jobs if they could, in order to support their children. The proverbial Irish washerwoman, and many ran boarding houses.
When you lose the father, you lose a lot. The women had to do an enormous backup there because there was no social security net. And the family's always trying to catch up for generations.
Well, the newspaper boys were working to provide for their mother. The kids had a territory. And if you sold a paper out of that territory, and the other kid caught you, and it was his territory, you had to buy the paper from him yourself, or you had to fight. They treated that just like somebody crossing a picket line into the line. Maybe that's where the battling come from. They didn't want you interfering with their income.
In 1955, a new kind of mining came to Butte, open pit. Pit mining relied on heavy equipment and trucks, machinery, not men. The era of underground mining was ending. The pit grew at an astonishing rate. Now Butte faced a quandary. The city was built on top of the ore deposit. Meadville, McQueen, and East Side disappeared into the pit. History itself seemed to disappear.